Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Brandon Swanson? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the disappearance, then offer my analysis. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30, 1989, and lived with his parents, Brian and Annette, in the town of Marshall, Minnesota. This is a small town almost 3 hours west of Minneapolis, right near the border with South Dakota. It is part of a farming community. Brandon was legally blind in his left eye since birth. Starting at the age of 15, he worked for a food store. In 2006, he was convicted of DUI. Apparently, Brandon managed to either retain his driver's license or get it back after the conviction. This would end up being a catastrophic occurrence. After graduating from high school in 2007, Brandon studied wind turbines at the Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, Minnesota. This is 30 miles northwest of Marshall. Brandon intended on transferring to a college in Iowa to continue his education. Eventually, he wanted to enroll in a 4-year university and pursue a career in science. Now moving to the timeline of the disappearance. On May 13, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was celebrating completing his second semester of college. This was the last day of class. He left his parents' home at about 6 p.m. and drove his Chevrolet Lumina to a party at a private residence in the town of Lind. This town is about 7 miles southwest of Marshall. While at the party, he consumed alcohol. This, of course, was not lawful because he was under 21. Apparently, this did not deter him. Sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m., Brandon left the home in Lind and drove to a second party at a home in the town of Canby. Brandon continued drinking at this party, consuming at least 1 shot of whiskey. He left the party at about midnight, now on May 14, ostensibly with the intent of traveling to his parents' home in Marshall. Again, Canby and Marshall are about 30 miles apart. The trip should have taken only about 40 minutes. Despite having consumed alcohol, Brandon's friends said that he did not appear to be intoxicated when he departed. Brandon took a very unusual route after leaving the party. The towns of Canby and Marshall are connected by State Highway 68. All Brandon needed to do to get home was drive southeast on this road. He was very familiar with this drive. Brandon decided to adopt a different strategy for getting home. It appeared as though Brandon was trying to avoid driving on Route 68 and instead selected smaller gravel and dirt roads that ran near the route. Most of the smaller roads in this area of Minnesota run north and south and east and west. Everything is kind of squared off. This meant that Brandon planned on driving in a stair-step fashion, like he would travel east on a road for a short distance, then turn south, then east, then south, working his way back to Marshall. The reason Brandon did this is not known, but the logical assumption is that he was trying to avoid law enforcement. Brandon was impaired due to his alcohol consumption and did not want to be arrested again. Even if he wasn't impaired, it was illegal for him to have consumed alcohol due to his age, so he would have been in trouble either way if confronted by the police. At about 1:15 a.m., Brandon's vehicle became stuck in a ditch near 390th Street, which runs east and west, and Lyon-Lincoln County Road, which runs north and south. This intersection is about 4,200 feet north of Route 68. Brandon was about 20 miles from his home in Marshall. It's not clear why Brandon drove into a ditch, but his entry most likely occurred at a low speed. His vehicle was not damaged, and he was not injured. He may have been trying to turn around after getting lost, and he misjudged how much room he had. Brandon used a cell phone and called his friends for assistance, but nobody answered. At 1:54 a.m., he called his parents. Brandon explained to them that his vehicle was in a ditch off a gravel road, and he was unharmed. He was extremely confident that he knew exactly where he was located. He thought that he was on a gravel road along a golf course in Lind. In reality, he was about 22 miles northwest of that position. Again, Lind is not far from Marshall. Brandon indicated that he would wait with the vehicle until his parents arrived. Throughout most of this incident, Brandon and his parents stayed in contact by phone, although they were disconnected several times and had to reconnect. When his parents traveled to the location in Lind, indicated by Brandon, there was no one there. Both Brandon and his parents flashed the headlights of their vehicles in the hope that they would see each other, but this tactic was not successful. Everyone was frustrated, and Brandon disconnected the phone. His mother called him back. Brandon told his parents that he could see lights in the distance, which he thought were from the town of Lind. He planned on walking to the town and going to a parking lot of a bar called the Lind Tavern. Brandon wanted his father, Brian, to pick him up there. After Brian dropped off Annette at home, he went back out with the intent of meeting Brandon in the bar parking lot. At 2:23 a.m., Brandon and his father connected once again on the phone. This would be their last call. As Brandon was walking, he remained on the phone with his father and described what he was doing. Brandon was on a road for most of the conversation, but then decided to take a shortcut through a field. He could hear running water in the distance, and he passed several fences and gravel roads. At about 3:10 a.m., 47 minutes into this last phone call, Brandon shouted the words, "Oh blank." The blank is a word that rhymes with hit. After this exclamation, the call disconnected. Brian made several attempts to call his son back, but there was no answer. Brandon's parents looked for him for a few hours without success. At 6:30 a.m., they reported Brandon missing to the police. Initially, the police were not too helpful, but eventually they tracked Brandon's cell phone, and everyone realized that he was nowhere near where he thought he was. At 12:30 p.m., Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina was found in the ditch about 2 miles northwest of Taunton. The car was in fact stuck. The door was open and the keys were missing from the ignition. There was no indication that Brandon was injured. Search dogs followed Brandon's scent to the edge of the Yellow Medicine River and then picked up the scent on the other side of the river, as if Brandon had entered the river and then climbed out. Brandon was not found. Multiple search efforts continued throughout the years. The authorities searched 122 square miles by the spring of 2011, although there were a few farmers who would not permit their land to be searched. No sign of Brandon has ever been detected, not his clothing, not his cell phone, not his car keys, nothing. Now moving to my analysis. What happened to Brandon Swanson? Let's take a look at the major theories in this case. Theory number 1 is that Brandon stumbled into a river and drowned. He was never found because he was swept away by the water. Looking at the factors that support this theory, Brandon was walking through farm fields in the dark, and he heard running water. There was a river near where his vehicle was stuck, which could have been up to 10 to 15 feet deep at that time of year. Brandon could have traveled as far as about 2.5 miles, which meant he could have easily reached the river. From the intersection, Brandon would have run into the river by walking west or south. Based on his belief that he was northeast of Lind, it makes sense that he would have walked southwest. Search dogs tracked his scent into the river and out of it on the other side. Perhaps Brandon re-entered the river after going in it and drowned. Falling in a river would explain a lot of unusual circumstances in this case. For example, why Brandon disappeared suddenly, why the phone call disconnected, why he didn't answer after that, and why none of his belongings were ever found. Everything he had swept away with him in the river. As far as the factors contradicting this theory, many searchers believed that they would have found him if he had fallen in the river. Even though the river could be deep in some places, it is not really a powerful river. It's been described more like a creek. At certain times of the year, parts of it are completely dry. Theory number 2 is that Brandon died somewhere other than the river, but still without any foul play. It was about 40 degrees when he went missing. Maybe he went into the river climbed back out, developed hypothermia, and died as a result. Or he could have fallen into a well or a cistern and died from the fall or hypothermia. Just like the first theory, this theory explains many of the unusual circumstances surrounding this case. Theory number 3 is that Brandon wanted to disappear. This was a staged incident, and he is living somewhere in peace, perhaps in another country. I think this is unlikely because Brandon did not have the motive or the ability to carry out a complex scam like this, and he had no way to support himself on the run. If he was trying to start a new life, why would he call his parents at all? Furthermore, Brandon was looking forward to transferring to a new college for the next school year. Theory number 4 is that Brandon met with foul play. This could have come in various forms. For example, maybe a farmer was upset that Brandon was trespassing and killed him as a result. Maybe Brandon made it out of the area and was murdered in a separate incident. Or perhaps a serial killer just happened to stumble upon Brandon. This theory would explain some of the unusual circumstances in this case, but there are many factors which contradict this theory. For example, Brandon never mentioned seeing anyone else in the area. If he had encountered a human being, he probably would have opened a dialogue. For example, Brandon may have asked a question like, "Where are we?" There wasn't really any motive to kill Brandon. He didn't have anything of value, and he didn't meet the profile that a serial killer would typically look for. How would a bad actor know where Brandon was and that he was in a vulnerable position? I've never heard any stories about serial killers who hide in rural areas overnight in 40-degree weather, hoping to find someone running through a farm field. When considering all the evidence, how would I rate these theories from most to least probable? I think the most likely theory is theory number 1. Despite the river not necessarily being the strongest, drowning in the river explains the circumstances of this case pretty well. Theory number 2, dying from exposure, is also a good theory. I would put this very close to theory number 1 in terms of likelihood. Next, I would go with theory number 4, foul play, and finally, theory number 3, Brandon wanted to start a new life. Assuming that Brandon is dead and he died from drowning or exposure, I think several factors contributed to this. Brandon had been drinking and may have been intoxicated. He was trying to avoid the police. His vision was impaired, and he was up late at night and may have been tired. I believe that Brandon decided to make his way on foot because he did not want to be caught by the police at his vehicle. He knew that would probably lead to the same consequences as being pulled over. The police would wonder how his car ended up in the ditch. This is a tragic case, but there is no escaping the reality that Brandon's death was completely preventable. The theme of this case is that he was overconfident and had a sense of entitlement. Brandon had previously been caught drinking and driving, and he was under 21, yet he continued to drink. He attempted to avoid the authorities by steering clear of the main route home. When his vehicle became stuck, he insisted that he knew where he was, but he wasn't even close. When his parents drove to the town of Lind but couldn't find him, Brandon was angry as if it was their fault, when in fact it was his fault. In his continued effort to avoid apprehension, Brandon recklessly walked across farm fields in the dark. Some have argued that this tragedy occurred because of a confluence of bizarre circumstances, but the truth is that Brandon contributed almost every bizarre circumstance. He put himself in danger. Now moving to my final thoughts. This case features yet another catastrophic outcome that can be tied to alcohol consumption. In this case, it may not have been the actual impairment caused by alcohol, but rather the desire to escape responsibility after consuming it. Either way, alcohol claimed another life. This substance has the ability to take a person's maladaptive traits and turn them into lethal traits. Those are my thoughts in the case of Brandon Swanson. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.